A quick recap of what happened on the island. One morning, people in uniform showed up at the airfield and started pulling boxes out of a truck. Inside the boxes are hundreds of dead mice. The cargo was loaded onto a helicopter and they took off over the forest. And what happens next looked more like a scene from a war movie. Flying low, almost skimming the treetops, a helicopter made one circle, then another, and people in uniform tossed out one carcass after another. Each mouse had a tiny parachute. They opened midair, turning the fall into a gentle glide. The mice drifted slowly down onto the branches. There are 2,000 of them. 2,000 little fur balls laced with toxic chemicals. The dropping of dead mice turned into a show that looked like a scientific experiment and a deranged military operation at the same time. All this really happened on Guam, a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean. Back in 2013, scientists dropped 2,000 dead mice from the air right here. It was a one-of-a-kind experiment, and if it's repeated in Florida, then, well, there are two ways it can go. Either it solves one of the state's biggest problems, or it brings it to an environmental disaster. Mice Paratroopers, Mission Florida. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do that thing under this video. So what exactly happened on Guam? For 3 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Department of Defense worked on a strategy that sounds like a scene straight out of a sci-fi movie, dropping dead mice with little parachutes. Guam became a testing ground in the fight against invasive species. The main target of the operation was the brown tree snake. This snake actually comes from Australia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, but after World War II, it accidentally ended up on Guam with the military ships. Its venom isn't deadly to humans, but for the island's ecosystem, the consequences were disastrous. The brown tree snakes wiped out almost all the local birds. 10 out of 12 species disappeared in just a few years. And when the birds were gone, the spiders took over the island. Their numbers were 40 times higher than on neighboring areas. There are other problems too. Snakes growing up to 10 feet have learned to climb power poles, causing massive blackouts. Scientists estimate that around 3 million of them live on the island. In some areas, there are as many as 5,000 snakes per 0.4 square miles. This threatens not only the wildlife, but also the tourism industry, which supports 160,000 residents of Guam. American scientists decided to exploit the weaknesses of the brown tree snakes, one of which turned out to be their appetite. These snakes eat anything they find and won't even shy away from dead prey. At the same time, they are fatally vulnerable to paracetamol, a common painkiller known in the U.S. as Tylenol. Safe for humans, it's toxic for brown tree snakes. That's why dead mice were laced with it. In fact, attempts to stop the snake invasion had been made before. Traps were set, inspectors were sent to search for snakes, but all these measures only slowed the population. They didn't solve the problem. So they decided to launch a large-scale aerial attack on rodents, part of an $8 million program. Interestingly, back in 2013, one expert said, there really is no other place in the world with a snake problem like Guam. But what about Florida? We've already talked about the invaders several times, but let's quickly recap. Over 500 non-native species have been brought into Florida, spreading across nearly 1.7 million acres and costing the state's residents over $500 million a year. Reptiles are a special case. There are just over 20 species in Florida, including about 6 species of snakes. Pythons and anacondas are the ones most often kept as exotic pets, but in Florida, they didn't just survive. The warm subtropical climate feels as comfortable to them as their native habitat. Without natural predators and with plenty of prey, the snakes have established self-sustaining populations and now push out native species. Everything the invaders eat is slowly vanishing. There's another problem. The invasive snakes brought along a deadly parasite that's native to their own populations. The parasite R. orientalis is a worm-like creature related to crustaceans. It attacks the respiratory system, causing pneumonia and breathing difficulties. The invasive snakes barely notice it, but when the parasite encounters an animal that hasn't evolved alongside it, the outcome can be fatal. In a 13-foot python, R. orientalis easily fits inside the trachea without affecting the animal's life. But for species like the pygmy rattlesnake, which is only 12 to 24 inches long, it's deadly. And that's exactly how the resilience of the entire local wildlife gets undermined. By different estimates, there are anywhere from 100 to 300,000 invasive snakes of just one species living in the Everglades. If you add up all 6, the number multiplies many times over. In short, the problem in Florida is obvious. There are snakes wiping out everything around them. There's also the case of Guam, where the solution was dead mice dropped by parachutes. Sounds perfect, right? But first we need to look at the details. We need to remember an important detail. On Guam, they were dropping dead mice from the air. That made them easier to transport and certainly more humane than tossing live animals out of a helicopter. Besides, there's the question, how do you neatly put a dose of poison into a live mouse? You don't have that problem with dead mice. At first glance, the method looks like it would work for Florida too. Boas and pythons have no trouble feeding on mice and rats, especially when they're young. Sure, a full-grown 13-foot python would rather go for a raccoon or an opossum, but at least part of the population should be thinned out. Looks like it all adds up. But there's something else. Dead prey doesn't work for all snakes. In the wild, a snake sees food as something that runs, feels warm, and is alive. And to trigger an attack, it needs visual, chemical, and thermal cues. Many snake species have organs that pick up infrared radiation. Basically, they see heat. Rattlesnakes are especially good at this, and they can strike their target with pinpoint accuracy even in total darkness, guided only by temperature differences. These sensors work not just as prey detectors, but also as an early warning system against predators. And that's where the problem comes in, even with a dead mouse hanging right in front of a snake's nose. The snake may just pass it by. In captivity, keepers deliberately teach their snakes to eat dead prey, but in the wild, there's nobody to do this. That's why in Guam, specialists spent 3 years observing the snake's habits before trying the experiment. They confirmed that brown tree snakes were fine with dead mice. But what about the Florida snakes? In lab conditions, Burmese pythons had no problem eating rats, rabbits, chickens, raccoons, and iguanas, all of them dead. But those were pythons in captivity, trained to that kind of diet. And in the wild, it could end in a very awkward way. Thousands of mice with parachutes landing in the trees and on the ground, while the pythons just slither right past. Plus, the local conditions are also very different. Guam is a tiny island in the northern Pacific, officially a U.S. territory. It sits almost 5,900 miles from San Francisco and more than 1,550 miles from Manila. Basically, it's a chunk of volcanic rock that once rose from under the water. At first, Guam looked like a swampy atoll until slow shifts pushed its current landscape above the surface. In short, a classic story. As is usually the case with remote islands, life got here by accident. Birds flew in from nearby lands, insects came with the wind, storms carried seeds. Plants and small animals settled on Guam the same way they did on other oceanic islands, by chance. But there were no snakes. I mean, not a single one. That's why the arrival of the brown tree snake turned into a disaster. Partly because brown tree snakes spend most of the day in trees, hunting birds, their eggs, and small mammals. Local birds evolved without snakes and had no defense mechanisms at all. The outcome was predictable: a massive die-off of birds. To give you an idea, before the snakes invaded, the island had 12 species of forest birds. Today, 10 of them are gone, and the remaining 2 species are hanging by a thread. Their numbers don't exceed 200. So when the U.S. started the program of dropping dead mice, scientists were sure only one species would take the bait, the invasive snake. The amount of poison was designed to kill only that one. For Guam, this operation carried almost zero risk. But Florida is a whole different story. There are 45 native snake species in the state, and they can be found in all sorts of habitats, from coastal mangroves and salt flats to swamps and dry uplands. Many even live peacefully near people. That's because snakes in Florida aren't enemies, they're part of the system. They keep rodent numbers in check, rodents that destroy crops and spread diseases dangerous to humans. Non-venomous snakes eat venomous ones and help maintain balance. But venomous snakes didn't appear in the ecosystem for no reason either. Scientists, for example, have noted that some rattlesnakes feed on ticks. If they started dropping poisoned mice over Florida, all these species will be at risk. You can't make bait that only invasive snakes will eat. The local species will try it too, and remember, they play a crucial role in the ecosystem. They become prey for birds and help control amphibian and rodent populations. On top of that, their situation is already tough. Many species are suffering from habitat loss. Tons of snakes die every year under car wheels or at the hands of people who kill them out of fear. And invasive pythons are putting pressure on them too. If poisonous mice are dropped on top of that, it will be a blow local populations simply can't recover from. Another thing about Guam is that there aren't that many large animals there. It's mostly birds, bats, crabs, and monitor lizards. Introduced species include deer and pigs, so when they were dropping mice there, nobody was really worried that some big animal would want to snack on them. Florida's a totally different story. There's an incredible variety of wildlife here. From the coral reefs of the Florida Keys to the cypress swamps of the Florida Panhandle, you can find over 700 species of land animals, 200 species of freshwater fish, 1,000 species of marine animals, and thousands of species of insects and other invertebrates. Florida's among the top 5 states with the most endemic species. And among those hundreds of species, there are plenty of predators and scavengers that will definitely be interested in a dead mouse. Foxes, opossums, bears, coyotes, lynxes, panthers, all of them could grab the prey. To be fair, the scientists had thought this through back when they prepared the Guam operation. The thing is, snakes are almost uniquely sensitive to paracetamol, the regular over-the-counter painkiller. Only 0.002 ounces, about 1/6 of a pill, is enough to kill a brown tree snake. For animals like dogs or pigs, a lethal dose would be roughly equal to 500 mice. So one mouse won't kill them. But the risks still remain. If a small animal eats not just one, but several poisoned carcasses, the consequences could be unpredictable. And considering the number of predators in Florida, some of the bait will almost certainly go where it's not supposed to. When mice were dropped on Guam, you could be sure that a good number of them would end up as snake food. In Florida, though, the competition for prey is way too high. Plus, there's the question of scale. On Guam, they dropped 2,000 mice and spent $8 million. How many would you have to drop in Florida? Twice as many? 3 times? 10 times? It's almost impossible to estimate. But even without exact numbers, it's clear the cost would be insanely high. And that's not all. According to PETA, eating poisoned mice can cause kidney and liver failure in snakes. For reptiles, death can come in a few days, or even weeks, meaning it's anything but quick and definitely not easy. Experts even pointed this out before the Guam operation. The method is extremely indiscriminate and poses serious risks, not just to snakes, but also to other predators and scavengers, as well as birds. Overall, everything points to the fact that dropping poisoned mice in Florida won't give the results people expect. Even in Guam, where the program is considered a success, it didn't wipe out all the snakes. From the very start, the U.S. government said the goal was to keep the population in check, not to eliminate it entirely. And that's on a tiny island where there was only one invasive species. On the north and south of Guam, there are thousands of acres of forest that people simply couldn't reach. And fighting the snakes there was impossible. That's why the operation with dead mice was only part of an ongoing war. In 2020, many years after the first drops, the U.S. Department of the Interior allocated another $3.4 million to continue the program. In general, no one had any illusions that the snakes could be wiped out. The goal was to stop them from taking over the island completely and to make sure the surviving birds could live. In Florida, the chances of complete success are even lower. First of all, it's not just one invasive species here, but a whole bunch. And secondly, there's an enormous variety of native animals, and it's exactly that which makes the program less effective and way more dangerous. So the situation is clear, though pretty sad. Lots of risks, lots of hassle, huge costs, and yet no benefit and no result. Guam and Florida are 2 completely different places. What worked on one remote island doesn't necessarily work in another, far more complex and full of life region. But that doesn't mean scientists have given up. On the contrary, this is exactly where new ideas are born, made especially for the Everglades. Let's take, for example, fluffy marsh rabbits. Any Burmese python would happily gobble them up. And be disappointed because these rabbits are robots. They were designed to lure giant snakes out of hiding. This is one of the newest ideas from the South Florida Water Management District. If it works, the robo-rabbits could help reduce the number of pythons, which, with their insatiable appetite, are wiping out all the local species. It's said that catching a python isn't that hard, but the real problem is you have to find it first. In the wild, these snakes blend in perfectly, and out of 100, you might spot only 1 to 3. That's why researchers decided if they can lure the predators with bait, there's a chance to turn things around. Innovative tools like robotic rabbits could be the breakthrough that changes the balance of power in the Everglades. This summer, they launched 120 mechanical rabbits in the experiment. By the way, they tried using real animals before, but it turned out to be too expensive and too much trouble. Robots are way easier. Basically, they're regular toys, but upgraded to give off heat and move like real rabbits. Remember, the python's prey has to look alive, and these rabbits really do look alive. They run on solar power and can be switched on remotely. Robo-rabbits are placed in small enclosures under camera surveillance. As soon as the camera spots a python getting close, a signal goes to the contractor. They show up and remove the snake. One of these robots costs around $4,000, and the project is funded by the Water Management District. It's still too early to say how successful the robot rabbit project will be, but the first results look promising. They don't need to be fed, there's no cleaning up after them, they're waterproof, and they're equipped with cameras and motion sensors. As soon as a python gets close, the system always sends a signal to the researchers. Of course, it's unclear whether they can really fool the snakes, but if the snakes turn out to be too cautious, the scientists have another trick. They can give the robots a real rabbit smell. In the end, the rabbits will look so convincing that even the wary pythons won't be able to resist. The main thing is to make sure these fluffy terminators don't get eaten too soon. Maybe there's something else that could help fight this invasive species. And yes, this time it's a real animal. Like I just said, finding pythons is tough. These water-loving reptiles blend perfectly into forested and swampy areas thanks to their coloring. They ambush their prey, which makes them masters of camouflage and stealth. Moreover, the search for pythons is complicated by vast and varied terrain, only 1% of which can be crossed by car or on foot. Drones with thermal cameras aren't much help either. When people use them to look for Burmese pythons, the results were, let's say, not great. The thing is, pythons are cold-blooded, so the device just doesn't pick them up. See where I'm going with this? Dogs could help here. They're well known for being easy to train, and dogs have already been trained to track other animals. For instance, dogs learn to detect the droppings of eastern spotted skunks, striped skunks, and black bears for another project. So why not use dogs for finding invasive pythons too? But actually, it wasn't that simple. First, the people behind the program had to survey the area to figure out which dogs to choose and how best to train them for this particular mission. And that's when trouble hit. They found out that most of the terrain was off limits for the dogs since it was mostly covered in water. The dogs wouldn't be able to work in the swampy areas because of alligators, local venomous snakes, and the jagged coral limestone terrain. People had to come up with a plan to use the dogs safely and effectively. The animals needed to be trained to handle the heat and humidity of South Florida, as well as the rough terrain of the Everglades. But it seems like they pulled it off. Further studies showed that dogs had higher success rates in spotting pythons compared to human search teams in controlled areas. And here's a real example of an actual dog. Florida's Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission recently began training Truman, a black Labrador retriever, along with another dog called Eleanor, to detect pythons by scent and warn their handlers when snakes are nearby. Their first success came in 2020, when Truman spotted an 8-foot Burmese python in the Rocky Glades public small game hunting area in Miami-Dade County. To get animals to accomplish their task, trainers work with towels smelling of python and live pythons fitted with surgically implanted trackers, training dogs to sense the snake's scent. Reportedly, these dogs were trained for over a month before venturing into the wild to start hunting. After a python is spotted, the dog and handler step back, clearing the way for the biologists so they can pinpoint exactly where the snake is and safely catch and remove it from the wild. The dogs have also been trained to ignore distractions while working outdoors, like other animals. On top of that, the dogs have built up endurance so they don't tire out as quickly in the field. Following their training program, Truman and Eleanor now go out 5 days a week with an instructor and a biologist searching for pythons across various public lands throughout South Florida. All that's left is to wish them luck. But robots and dogs are just part of the overall strategy. In Florida, programs have been running for several years that allow pythons to be humanely killed year-round on private land and areas controlled by the Wildlife Commission. They also hold the annual Florida Python Challenge here. Participants get cash rewards for the most snakes caught, the longest individual, and other categories. It's a way to get people involved in the fight and a chance to take out at least some of the invaders. But dealing with snakes in Florida isn't just about people, technology, and competitions. Dogs are involved too, sometimes against snakes. They even release other snakes. This spring, dozens of eastern indigo snakes were released in Florida's Panhandle. Biologists explained it's not a new species, but local predators being reintroduced into the wild to help get rid of invasive species and restore the ecosystem's balance. A total of 42 individuals were released in North Florida, all raised at the Orion Indigo Conservation Center in Lake County. This is already the 9th year of such releases, and this one was the largest yet. Over the years, the program has reintroduced more than 200 snakes. Some of them have already started breeding in the wild, but so far no one knows how many survive in the long run or how soon their historical range can be restored. There's also the question of whether the program can expand beyond North Florida and South Alabama. Indigo snakes in the U.S. have actually been on the endangered species list since 1978. Their numbers dropped after their habitats were destroyed. To save the species, state and federal agencies have been working with wildlife centers for almost a decade. All the more so, Florida really needs indigo snakes. They're big, non-venomous, and omnivorous predators. They eat birds, small mammals, and even other snakes, including venomous ones, helping keep the natural balance. For example, in this video, filmed by researchers, an indigo snake kills and eats a newborn Burmese python. It's not a threat to adult pythons because it's not big enough, but it can hunt the young. And this is important. By wiping out the babies, indigo snakes can help control the population of invasive predators. The more young snakes are killed, the fewer adults will emerge. By the way, robotic rabbits and the release of indigo snakes are just part of a much bigger strategy. In the coming years, researchers plan to combine different tools, expand the program with dogs that can track pythons by scent, and use genetic technologies to locate and reduce the population. And of course, working with people will play an important role. Education and responsible pet ownership should act as a barrier to future invasions. All in all, these methods, robots, dogs, releasing snakes, show that scientists are looking for solutions and trying all sorts of approaches. But it's important to remember the very idea of dropping something from the air isn't some fantasy. On the contrary, such operations in Florida have long been part of everyday life. Back in 1997, over 130,000 doses of oral rabies vaccine were spread in Pinellas County from January to April using helicopters and cars. On average, that came out to about 185 baits per 0.4 square miles. To check the results, biologists examined the teeth and bones of raccoons, opossums, feral cats, and foxes caught that same year. The biomarker tetracycline showed who had eaten the bait. And this practice hasn't stayed in the past. In 2024, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture announced it would start distributing Raboral VRG vaccine baits every year. The goal? To stop raccoon rabies before it spreads to Central America. The method is proven. In rural areas, baits are dropped from planes. In suburbs, they use helicopters, and in cities, they hand them out or distribute them from vehicles. To make sure the animals don't pass it by, the bait is coated with a special scented mix. Everything goes in: vegetable fats, wax, powdered sugar, oil, green dye, and even a hint of marshmallow. For wild animals, it's really tempting, but for people and pets, the bait is completely safe. There's no way to catch rabies from it. Most doses get eaten within 4 days, and almost all are gone within a week. In short, the method is simple and has been perfected over the years. In some states, they've been doing this for decades. In 2024, for example, it marked 30 years of the rabies vaccination program in Texas. They use 4 planes and 1 helicopter here, flying 8 to 16 sorties a day at altitudes between 492 and 980 feet. Baits are dropped every 2,600 feet, and in just one season, Texas spreads more than 800,000 doses. The density is 25 to 27 baits per 0.4 square miles. This experience shows dropping something from the air really works. It just needs to provide protection, not a threat to the ecosystem. You owe me a like. See you later.